Some stories don't explode into the world. They slip in like a shadow, quiet, unnoticed, until the moment everything breaks. In Easton City, Illinois, on a thick August night, a narcotics officer was found face down in a narrow alley, a single bullet wound in his skull. A few feet away stood the woman he wasn't supposed to love, a drug informant with too many enemies and not enough time. She didn't run, she didn't scream. She just said, almost calmly, "He tried to kill me." But the truth wasn't that simple. Hours before that shot, buy money meant for a drug sting went missing. A gang realized they'd been betrayed. And the officer, the one everyone trusted, agreed to disappear with her. Fear met desperation. Secrets collided. And by the time they stepped into that alley, there was only one way the night could end. This is True Crime's Altar, and this is the story of the affair that spiraled into an execution. In August 2015, the heat in Easton City felt like it had crawled into the bones of the buildings and refused to leave. Officer Derek Lyle noticed it every time he stepped out of his patrol car. It wasn't just warmth, it was pressure, the kind that made people impatient, irritable, reckless. He should have recognized the danger in that feeling, because the moment he crossed the line with his informant, every bit of pressure found its way straight into his life. Kiona Hale had been working with the department for months, long enough for Derek to learn the sound of her footsteps and the way her voice changed when she spoke about the life she was trying to outrun. She was quick-witted, always 2 steps ahead of the dealers she fed intel on, and she had a survival instinct so sharp it felt like another sense. He told himself he admired her professionalism, her courage, her knowledge of the streets. But the truth was simpler. He admired her, full stop. And admiration, for a man like him, was the first slide toward a conflict he wasn't built to handle. Their relationship didn't shift overnight. It shifted gradually, in the quiet moments at the end of long surveillance nights, or the times she trusted him with details she wouldn't put in an official statement. She told him about the scar on her arm from when a dealer tried to teach her a lesson. She told him about the friend she lost after a bad batch of fentanyl hit the blocks. She told him about the nights she slept in stairwells just to stay away from a boyfriend whose temper had no limits. These weren't things she shared with detectives. They were things she shared with him. And he let her, knowing full well that a line had already been crossed long before either of them admitted it. By the time October rolled around, Derek was stopping by her building more often than he had reason to. The visits became patterns. He'd sit in his cruiser, headlights off, checking his mirrors as if expecting someone to notice he'd strayed from his assigned patrol. When she finally slipped into the passenger seat, she would take a breath like she hadn't been breathing all day. One night she told him she felt eyes on her, not from the police or neighbors, but from the men she used to answer to. She said it quietly, without raising her voice or glancing over her shoulder, and that calmness unsettled him more than panic would have. It meant she'd grown used to danger. He told her she needed to lay low. She told him she had nowhere to go. The silence that followed stretched thin, until she reached out and rested her hand on top of his. When he didn't pull away, the line between officer and informant snapped like it was nothing more than thread. By early November, their connection had developed into something neither of them dared to define, yet both depended on. She expected him to protect her. He expected her to trust him. It worked until the department assigned her to a major buy operation, targeting a supplier for the Southview Kings. The kind of operation where one mistake could ripple through months of undercover work and sabotage an entire case. Derek wanted her far away from it, but the orders were clear. She was the only one the supplier recognized, and the only way they could justify moving the buy forward. When he told her, she didn't panic. She simply looked at him for a long moment, eyes focused and disbelieving, and asked whether he really thought she could walk into that meeting without consequences. He didn't answer right away. He tried to assure her the unit would be nearby, the logistics team would be watching, the supplier wouldn't risk drawing attention. She listened, but he could tell his words weren't reaching her. When she finally responded, her voice was steady, too steady when she said she wanted out when the operation was done. Not out of the neighborhood, out of the city entirely. She said it like she'd been rehearsing the request for days. That night, he replayed her words while lying on his back in bed, staring at a ceiling. The idea of helping her disappear pressed heavily on his chest. It meant falsifying reports, cutting ties with the unit, maybe even facing felony charges if the fallout went badly. But the alternative, letting her return to the same people she'd betrayed, felt unthinkable. He told himself he'd find a way. He just didn't know what that way would cost. 3 days before the scheduled buy, Kiona's anxiety became impossible to hide. She kept pacing when she spoke to him, lighting cigarettes she never finished, jumping at small sounds. When he asked what she heard, she explained that one of the king's younger runners had seen her talking with a detective last week, and word had started circulating that someone in their circle was feeding information to the police. She didn't say her name. She didn't have to. Derek's stomach tightened. The day of the operation, December 12th, the buy money was counted twice and sealed in a padded envelope. Derek was responsible for transporting it to the staging site. He drove with the envelope on the passenger seat, every red light and pedestrian crossing feeling like a threat. He arrived early, checked in with the team, and waited for her. She didn't show. At 9:37 p.m., he stepped outside the surveillance van and checked his phone again. No messages, no calls. He tried her number twice, then a third time. The anxiety that simmered beneath his ribs suddenly flared. He got into his cruiser and began searching the usual places. Her cousin's apartment, the bus stop on Laurel, the alley behind a bar she occasionally smoked behind. It was nearly an hour later when he finally found her behind a boarded laundromat, pacing in frantic circles. The moment she saw him, she rushed toward him, talking quickly, her voice thin and strained. She told him she overheard 2 King's members discussing her name. Not a suspicion. Confirmation. Someone had exposed her, and the gang intended to deal with her quietly, without making a scene. She said she was as good as dead if she showed up to the buy. Before he could form a response, she admitted she'd taken the buy money. All of it. Tens of thousands of dollars. She explained that she'd watched him for months, seen how much he cared, how badly he wanted to protect her. She believed they could escape together, vanish before the Kings and the department realized what had happened. Her voice cracked when she said it, not from guilt, but from desperation. He stared at her, stunned. The consequences ran through his mind like fire. Internal affairs, suspension, federal charges, the end of everything he'd built. She watched his face change as he realized what her actions meant for him. She knew then that he wasn't going to run, that he would protect his badge even if he didn't want to admit it. The next night, when they met in the alley behind Carter Avenue, neither of them arrived as the person they'd been a week earlier. Derek walked toward her with the weariness of a man dragging the weight of 2 lives on his shoulders, his own and the woman he couldn't save. She stood with her hands deep in her jacket pockets, the tension in her posture coiled and ready. He told her they needed to turn in the money, claim she acted out of panic, and allow the system to work something out. He spoke carefully, as if afraid any word might set off an explosion. She listened, But there was no relief in her expression. She told him the moment she returned the money, she would be killed by the kings or locked away by the same system that used her until she broke. She told him she couldn't trust protection programs that burned through informants without a second thought. Then she asked whether he was turning her in. He didn't answer right away, and that silence filled the alley with tension thick enough to suffocate. She reached into her jacket slowly, not to threaten him, but with the resigned understanding that he had made his choice long before he walked into the alley. His eyes widened slightly, realizing she had his backup gun, taken from his glove compartment earlier that afternoon. He raised a hand as if words might fix what had already been shattered. She stepped back, her breath unsteady. She said she loved him. She said he wasn't the man she thought he was. She said he'd chosen the badge over her life. By the time he took a step forward, the outcome had already been decided. The gunshot cracked through the alley like lightning. Derek collapsed instantly, the force dropping him before his body understood what happened. She stood there for several long seconds, frozen in the echo of her own decision, the gun trembling in her hand. When the first patrol car screeched onto the street, she didn't run. When the officers rushed toward her, guns drawn, she lifted her hands and said Derek had tried to kill her. She repeated the claim calmly, as if she had been practicing the line all night. But the truth, layered with fear, betrayal, desperation, and survival, was far more complicated. And the investigation that followed would expose every secret they both fought to bury. The alley behind Carter Avenue stayed loud for hours after the gunshot, even though the street itself fell quiet again. Blue and red lights flashed against brick like slow, pulsing warnings. Neighbors lingered behind fences and half-drawn curtains. Every so often, one of them whispered a version of what they thought they saw. A shadow, a figure, a flash, and every version contradicted the last. Kiana sat on the curb with her wrists cuffed in front of her, legs pulled close to her chest, as if making herself smaller would make the world shrink with her. She didn't ask for water or air or space. She didn't look at the officers who circled around or the sheet they draped over the man lying in the dirt. The lights made the sweat on her face shine, but she didn't blink it away. She just stared at the ground like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. Detective Raiden Cross arrived at 11:19 p.m., summoned from home, stepping out of an unmarked sedan with a kind of contained urgency. He'd worked hundreds of cases, but something in the pit of his stomach twisted when he heard the victim's name over the radio. Derek Lyle. A man he'd mentored years earlier. A man he respected, even when he disagreed with him. Seeing Derek's body under that sheet cracked something private inside him. Something he couldn't show here. He inhaled slowly, letting his breath settle as he took in the scene. The trajectory of the shell casing, the streak marks on the wall, the scuffed pavement where someone had struggled, or hesitated, or both. He saw no overturned trash cans, no signs of chaotic movement. Everything looked controlled, like two people speaking in the dark until one made a decision. He approached Kiana last. She didn't lift her head when he crouched beside her. Sweat rolled down her temple. Her breathing stayed shallow, but her voice, when she finally spoke, did not shake. He tried to kill me. No panic, no attempt to rationalize or soften, just a crisp, practiced statement, each word shaped by a kind of exhausted certainty. "We're going to talk more at the station," Raiden said quietly, studying her posture, her avoidance, the stiffness in her shoulders. "But right now I need to know if you're injured." "No." He waited, giving her a chance to say more. She didn't. 2 uniforms helped her up, and she walked with them without resistance. The whole time, she never once looked back at Derek's body. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights hummed with a cold steadiness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the scene. They placed her in interview room 3. Metal table, 2 chairs, a camera blinking above the door. Raiden watched her through the one-way glass for several minutes. She sat perfectly still, except for her fingers, which tapped an erratic rhythm against the underside of the table. Her knee bounced once every few seconds, like she was keeping time with a clock only she could hear. At 12:41 a.m., Raiden stepped inside with a thin file. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Everything written inside could wait until he understood the look on her face. Tell me what happened tonight. She lifted her eyes, slowly, as though each glance cost her something. He met me in the alley. He was angry. I didn't understand why at first. Then he said I ruined his life. He grabbed his gun. I tried to stop him.
Raiden watched the movements of her mouth, her eyes, the tiny twitches near her jawline. The story was too clean, too straightforward, too immediate. A narrative built faster than shock could have allowed. What time did you get there? A little after 10. What were you talking about? Nothing that mattered. That sounds like something that matters. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath tightening. You wouldn't believe me. Try me. She opened her eyes again. He wasn't the man you think he was. The line was designed to provoke a reaction. Raiden didn't give her one. He simply wrote something down he didn't need written and closed the folder. We'll talk again, he said. She didn't respond. By sunrise, Internal Affairs had claimed a corner of the precinct, setting up computers, coffee, and the quiet hum of bureaucracy. Officers avoiding eye contact became the norm. Those who did look at each other exchanged expressions full of disbelief and the sour taste of betrayal. The situation was spiraling faster than anyone anticipated. They began digging. Phone logs, body cam GPS signals, patrol reports, bank withdrawals. Derek's financial records revealed something unusual. Withdrawals that didn't match his spending patterns. The amounts weren't enormous, but weren't negligible either, and they added up to an odd picture when placed alongside the missing buy money. At 9:14 a.m., Raiden attempted another interview with Kiona. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. Her hair, once parted neatly, had started to fall from the tension she carried in every muscle. When she spoke, her voice was softer, thinner. He fell apart, she said, staring at the table. He accused me of setting him up. He said I dragged him into something he couldn't escape. Nothing about the description matched Derek's reputation, but reputations were just polished masks. Raiden didn't dismiss the possibility. Not yet. Not when so many details were still floating without anchors. On December 14th, mid-morning, a patrol unit located the padded cash envelope buried near a storm drain 3 blocks from the laundromat. The money was intact, untouched, still marked. Raiden stared at it on the evidence table, knowing immediately what it meant. She hadn't run because she didn't know where to run. She didn't spend the money because spending it would expose her instantly. She returned it because she realized she needed a different kind of story. One where she wasn't the thief. One where she was the survivor. That afternoon, at 3:58 p.m., Raiden entered the interview room for the final time. Kiona sat with her arms folded on the table, her head lowered. You returned the money. She didn't look up. I don't know what you're talking about. You buried it near a storm drain on 5th. We found it.
A flicker of emotion moved across her face too quickly to name. You could have left town with that cash, but you didn't. You came back. You walked into that alley instead. She swallowed hard. You and Derek were involved, he said quietly. Don't deny it. It's all over the precinct. People saw the way you look at each other. Her fingers curled inward, nails digging into her palms. Tell me what happened, he said. Tell me the part you've avoided. Her eyes lifted. Something raw trembled there. A mix of exhaustion, fear, maybe even grief. I tried to save myself, she whispered. That's what happened. She didn't elaborate. Not yet. The next 3 days became a blur of paperwork, interviews, procedural motions, and growing departmental panic. The city erupted with rumors, some fueled by fact, others by the sensational pull of a story involving a cop, an informant, and a shotgun in a dark alley. Reporters flocked to the precinct steps, shoveled into microphones by station producers hungry for quotes. Statements from the Kings added another layer of tension. A lieutenant claimed Derek wasn't killed by them, but the gang knew why it happened. The cryptic phrasing added weight to an already convoluted story. Raiden spent hours reconstructing the timeline. Derek's messages, Kiona's movements, the missing money, the recovered envelope, the lack of struggle in the alley, the angle of the shot, execution style, not accidental. Everything pointed to deliberation. On December 18th, prosecutors filed charges.
Manhunt-level media coverage surged. Overnight, the informant who once moved through Easton City unnoticed became the focus of a narrative she could no longer control. Some painted her as a dangerous manipulator who lured Derek into a deadly trap. Others cast her as a victim, cornered by a system that exploited her desperation. When she was transferred to county jail, dozens watched her walk through the corridor, her wrists cuffed, her eyes forward, her face unreadable. She didn't look at Raiden. She didn't look at anyone. In jail, she maintained her silence. Public defenders rotated in and out, trying to understand the truth beneath her clipped sentences. Some believed her, some didn't, but none could ignore how her story was shifting, not drastically, but subtly, bending itself around the new facts she learned from them. The prosecution built a case around motive, the fear of exposure, the stolen money, the affair, the pressure of the Southview Kings. The defense leaned heavily on the history of informant abuse, the lack of cameras, and the impossibility of knowing what truly happened in an alley without witnesses. The trial began on March 4th, 2016. The courtroom buzzed with tension from the first day. Officers filled the rows behind the prosecution. Community members packed the opposite side. Reporters lined the back wall like vultures waiting for a signal. Kiona sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture rigid. She maintained the same controlled breathing she'd held since the night of the shooting. She listened without reacting while prosecutors described Derek as a man who lost his life trying to do the right thing. She listened without blinking while they displayed photos of the crime scene. Her expression barely changed. Raiden watched all of it from the gallery, a cold heaviness settling deeper into his ribcage each day. When she took the stand, the entire room fell silent. Her voice was soft but steady. She described her fear of the Kings. She described Derek's shift in behavior. She described his anger. She described reaching for the gun as he reached for it. She described the discharge as accidental. She did not cry. The jury watched her closely, trying to decide whether she was composed because she was innocent or because she was not. The prosecution countered with expert testimony, angle of entry, lack of residue on her arms, trajectory suggesting deliberate aim. They dismantled the claim of a struggle piece by piece. They described Derek's financial withdrawals. They introduced evidence of the buy money's disappearance and recovery, implying intent. The closing arguments lasted nearly 3 hours. The prosecution painted her as calculating.
The defense painted her as desperate. Somewhere between the two portraits, the truth twisted into something neither side could fully capture. The jury deliberated for 15 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into a suffocating hush. The judge took the paper, read it, nodded once. Guilty. Kiona closed her eyes and lowered her head. No tears, no pleadings, no collapse. She looked almost relieved, like the verdict had removed the need to hold the world together by herself. At sentencing 2 weeks later, she stood before the judge with her hands clasped. She apologized for the pain caused, but she did not admit guilt. The judge, stern but not cruel, handed down decades. After the courtroom emptied, Radin remained seated for several minutes staring at the wood grain on the bench in front of him. He thought of Derek, the weight he carried, the choices he made, the blind spots that cost him his life. He thought of Kiona, the trauma she survived, the decisions she made, the fear that shaped her final hours with Derek. He thought of the alley behind Carter Avenue, silent again now, stripped of meaning except for the memory lodged inside it, an ordinary crack between buildings where a dozen futures had collapsed. Radin stepped outside into the cold March air and inhaled deeply. The city moved on around him, cars honking, kids laughing in the distance, wind stirring trash along the sidewalk. Life continued. It always did. But cases like this stayed. They buried themselves. They took shape in the quiet. They lingered like unfinished sentences. And long after the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, the truth remained fractured. Two people standing in an alley, bound by fear, secrets, and a stolen moment that neither could walk away from. In the end, survival was the only motive that mattered. And survival, Radin knew, never came without a cost. Sometimes the deadliest moments don't happen in a firefight or a chase. They happen in the quiet places, alleys, whispers, stolen secrets, where love and fear collide. An officer, an informant. One desperate choice, one fatal shot. And a truth so twisted that no one walked away untouched. If you were standing in that alley, knowing what they knew, what choice would you have made? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark, gripping, true crime stories every week here on True Crime's Altar.